Welcome to Global Minds, the Harvard Alumni for Global Development podcast. We explore global development through the people driving it, bringing together leaders from across disciplines to share their journeys, insights, and what it takes to create meaningful change in the world. I'm your host, Michelle Kawamoto Perry, and today we're joined by Naabia Ofosu-Amaah, whose career sits at the powerful intersection of environmental conservation, international development, and private sector engagement. Naabia currently works at the Nature Conservancy, one of the largest conservation organizations in the world, where she focuses on freshwater solutions across global systems. Her path from growing up between Washington, D.C. and Ghana to studying environmental science and political science at Harvard University to working across Africa on water sanitation and conservation offers a compelling lens on how to make sustainability work at scale. Naabia, welcome to Global Minds. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Really glad to be here today. Apologies if you hear any sirens in the background. I'm here in Washington, D.C., but really happy to be here with you today.
Well, now, you've lived at the crossroads of global systems from a very young age. You come from a Ghanaian family, grew up in Washington, D.C., and spent every other summer in Ghana. How did moving between those worlds shape how you understand development and inequality?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And I feel is a very unique one. Not a lot of people get this opportunity to be able to travel internationally from such a young age. But for me, I think it really did shape my worldview from childhood. Seeing how my family lived here in Washington and what things were like here around our environment and how we engage with our environment and what we were learning in school about the natural environment and spending that time in Ghana every other summer and seeing how my cousins, my family were living and just how different things were. And knowing from a very young age that the world is different in different places. You have so much different contexts where you are, and the way that people engage in their environment is really different depending on their local geography and their culture. And so I did have a lot of interest in kind of understanding and noticing those small differences and also seeing where that came through from a water perspective. So going to Ghana, sometimes not having access to water every day, sometimes not having the ability to take a shower or have clean drinking water, and seeing that from a young age and noticing that that was different to my context in Washington, D.C.
And your parents worked at the World Bank. Do you remember early moments when you started to understand how global institutions influence real lives?
I can think of multiple moments with that. I was thankful to have my parents speak about their work and have lots of friends over for dinners. And so I can remember lots of moments sitting around the dinner table and hearing the conversations that the adults were having about projects that they were working on and the impacts that they were seeing. So I think there were multiple moments that come to mind. One was a solar cooker project that my mom was working on in an environmental organization that she was supporting, where they were testing out solar cookers to see if that was something that could be deployed in different parts of Africa to minimize harmful impacts from, cooking inside of homes. And could you use solar power to cook different things? So we took our solar cooker, we set it up out on our deck in Washington, D.C. to see, could we make rice? Could we cook some of the things that we were accustomed to eating? And it kind of worked. It didn't work as great as we could, but working in Washington, D.C., thinking about what sort of solutions could help people in different contexts around the world, testing them out and seeing how they could work, and then thinking, wow, my mom is going to work on this, and this is going to be something that people in other parts of the world may use and may help their lives, may change their lives, is one moment that I remember very vividly.
Clearly, you were surrounded by a lot of innovation.
Yes, definitely. There were solutions like that. Also, hearing about different large scale projects that my dad was involved in at the World Bank, things like the Chad Cameroon pipeline in West Africa, and thinking about bringing energy to different countries. Also, My father was involved in the setting up of the Global Environment Facility. So thinking about, setting up specific mechanisms for funding environmental issues. And when you're a small kid, it's hard to understand exactly the intricacies of what's being talked about. But I think this idea that there are large institutions out there that are thinking about how do we help different countries across the world reach their potential, think about different ways to ensure access to basic services, to ensure that people around the world are healthy, have livelihoods, and that there is this ability to gather all the resources from all these different countries around the world and these brilliant minds that are part of these institutions come up with these ideas, innovate, test things out, and take those up to scale was something that I saw was possible through my family experience.
And you attended a Quaker school, which emphasized environmental stewardship and inclusion and diversity. Looking back, how did those values show up later in your professional choices?
Yes. Yeah, I was fortunate to attend a Quaker school. I really believe in a Quaker education. I send my kids to Quaker schools now. And I do think that all of those principles, so they talk about the Quaker spices of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. And so that stewardship piece I can remember from as young as elementary school into middle school, this understanding that, we are people, but we're part of nature, we're part of the natural environment, and it's our responsibility as people to steward that environment and kind of steward our home on this planet and make sure that we're treading lightly and taking care of this planet that we call home. So there were lots of little things in elementary school around recycling and things like that. And then in middle school, it did turn into more of an academic exercise. So thinking about environmental science and going out into the stream and monitoring stream quality was something that I did around ages 12 and 13 as part of my schooling, and something that I kind of roped my parents into, of taking me out into the stream that was near our house and trying to be a part of those kind of scientific experiments that we were doing. So I think in addition to that, being part of a community that really valued diversity and valued the international nature of a place like Washington, D.C., and people coming from so many different parts of the world and trying to build community wherever you are, as well as having that appreciation and responsibility to steward your natural environment, are principles that I learned at a very young age and that definitely have played into my professional choices, and my academic choices as well.
And speaking of your educational choices, you didn't start out fully committed to environmental science. You came to that later. What clicked for you in that high school senior year environmental science course?
Yeah, I had a lot of interest, as I think we all do when we're, adolescents and teenagers. There's lots of different things that you're interested in exploring. And so when I was finishing up high school and going into college, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to study. I was considering economics or mathematics, or, I knew that I liked science. I knew that I was interested in these international development issues, and that I really did have an appreciation for the environment and really was an environmentalist at heart. So was open to considering lots of different things. And so in that senior year environmental science course, I had a really wonderful teacher, Ms. Paula Wong, who took us out into the environment here in Washington, D.C. And so we continued things like that stream monitoring that I mentioned, but also different activities around construction, taking us to a construction site, seeing how the earth was being moved. How could you minimize the impact on the environment in the construction process, and following that over time. And so for me, environmental science felt like a really great intersection of all of my interests. I could use the science that I was really interested in from chemistry and physics. And I also saw how that science was really affecting people, and being able to understand how you can use your scientific expertise and scientific knowledge and understand how systems work can help to improve people's lives and can help to minimize that impact on the environment. And it is possible for you as a society to develop and to improve without harming the environment. And so that was a question that was really brought to light for me that senior year. And it's a question that I think I continue to try to answer throughout my career.
And then at Harvard, you studied environmental science and political science with a secondary in social anthropology. How did that interdisciplinary mix shape the way that you think about environmental problems?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate to have been part of the environmental science and public policy program, which is still there at Harvard. I was just speaking to some of the students a couple weeks ago who were in that program, and a lot of what was discussed in that kind of brown bag lunch that I was a part of was about the interdisciplinary nature of the program and how beneficial that has been. And I think because these issues of environment, as I've mentioned, they transcend so many different areas of life and also so many different sectors of society. So that ability to talk to engineers, to policymakers, to lawyers, to corporations, to local community members about the challenges they're facing or the problems that you're trying to solve, and understanding all of those different disciplines that are involved has been very important for me throughout my career working in environmental issues.
And then your undergraduate thesis focused on ecotourism in Tanzania as a tool for economic development. What did that research teach you about the promises and also the limitations of market based solutions?
Yeah, that was a great experience being able to spend some time in Tanzania with the support of Harvard and my wonderful supervisor, Bill Clark at the Kennedy School. That experience taught me a lot about the promise and the limitations of some of these market-based tools. So my thesis was titled kind of Conservation for Sustainable Development question mark. So that question again that I mentioned of is it possible to have this sort of economic development and not harm the environment? And also can you use environmental conservation to promote development. So, trying to see how things like the rise of the national parks in Tanzania and the fees that were being brought in the country, were those really generating development? Were those going back to the communities who were living in those parks? And also some of the smaller scale programs. So there were some really truly community based programs, some communities in different parts of Tanzania near Arusha that had these lovely waterfalls in communities of 100 or so people, and they were marketing themselves and bringing people into the community to hike and see those waterfalls. And you could see at that very small scale that having a waterfall, having a natural asset in your community was something that was bringing development to these communities. When you scaled that up though and kind of looked at those national parks and saw those kind of, as you're talking about, market mechanisms, it was hard to see how the benefits that the country was getting were always trickling down to the local community members who were living there. So I think there are lots of I guess intricacies, and it's very complex to think about when you take these questions up to scale and you're thinking about development for an entire country, who does that benefit and why? And how to ensure that the development that may be coming from this is equitable and that all of the communities that are living in these spaces are benefiting is a very complex and challenging question. So my thesis answered, it kind of depends. It depends on uh, how much this development is benefiting the communities who are living in these spaces and conserving the environment. But on the whole, I still see that it is possible that conservation can contribute to development in these spaces.
And then after graduating, you worked on domestic environmental policy with the US EPA, focused on groundwater and drinking water. What surprised you about how complex water systems are, even in the US?
Yeah, I was, there were lots of things that I was surprised by in that first role. I think coming out of the undergraduate academic experience and going into the workforce, there's a lot that you learn very quickly in that short period of time about how the world really works. I think that one thing that was surprising to me, and that that was my first time really working in the water space. I didn't study water across multiple courses at Harvard. There were a couple courses that touched on it, but it wasn't an academic focus for me. So, coming out working at the EPA, one of the things that I did in that job was focused on helping to administer groundwater and drinking water surveys across the country. So, being someone, an analyst on the team who was calling up different managers of water systems across the US and asking them to answer some questions about how they manage their water. And so, one thing that was really surprising and came through very, very clearly to me was just how context specific water challenges are. Every watershed is different, every community is different. Sometimes you're thinking about the groundwater challenges. There are some parts of the country in the US that it's a very dispersed network of wells that are being managed by one person. Other parts, it's these large rivers that are being managed by multiple states. And so the answers to those questions were so varied to those surveys. And I can see how challenging it is for a country as big as the United States to manage this system kind of from a national perspective. So having these local community managers who are really understanding what are the challenges of this watershed or this groundwater aquifer, how are we going to meet the federal standards, but then also how are we going to meet our local standards and what do we need to do? It was just a very complex challenge. And so coming out of that academic experience where I was studying things like the climate challenge, where you have this global goal that you're trying to achieve, and you're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, where if you emit them anywhere in the world, that has a global impact. Water is so different, water is so local. And so that really did come through to me that if you're working in a water space and you want to have that impact, you really do need to understand what's happening immediately where you are and in that local space. And so I'm really glad I had that experience. It really helped and served me and continues to serve me throughout the rest of my career. But it was definitely surprising and unexpected in that first role.
You then made a conscious decision to pivot toward international work and pursued a master's at Cambridge. What were you hoping to gain from that shift?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that experience working around the US EPA work. And I had this interest in understanding how different cultures engage with their environment, and also wanting to see how I was having a difference around just international development in general. And so that first role was very domestically focused in the US, and I felt that I could make a bigger difference with the education that I had and the interest that I had if I were able to work more internationally. And so I thought about different ways of doing that. Could I try to find a job somewhere outside of the US? And I was hoping to think about a different network beyond the United States. So that's part of the reason why I looked at universities outside the US, and then also found a program that was quite similar to the environmental science and public policy course, thinking about an interdisciplinary program that was looking at conservation and development, but that was focused on, environmental conservation in developing country contexts. So it was kind of the perfect program in terms of what I was interested in. It was the University of Cambridge Department of Geography, Environment, Society, and Development course. And so it really did pique my interest in terms of the academic questions I was interested in exploring, but also interest in making a shift into more international work. Unfortunately, the course no longer exists, but it was a perfect program for kind of what I was hoping to do, which was take the interest that I had and the experience that I'd had working in environmental consulting and think about how I could translate that more into the developing world.
And your master's research took you to Rwanda, examining whether plastic bans help or hinder development. What did you learn about the tension between environmental protection and economic growth?
Yes, I learned a lot in that experience as well. Learned that, so at the time, Rwanda was the first country that had really considered a ban on plastics, and then that implemented this ban in 2007, 2008 timeframe. So right around the time that I was studying. And so it was interesting thinking about how different countries and countries of different sizes and in different contexts thought about environmental protection. It was thought that the Rwandan government took a lot of cues from places like Singapore that had very strict policies and regulations around cleanliness of the environment. And So the thinking was, these plastic bags that have been littered around this country, we can very easily clean this up. And we just need to put a regulation in place to say no more plastic bags, but also no more plastic packaging. So thin plastics of any kind are no longer allowed in the country. And so when I was doing this research, I basically went around the entire country. I went to border crossings. I was at the airport to see what was happening when people are trying to bring plastics into the country. They're searching your bags and taking plastic bags out. You saw plastic bags being thrown on the other side of the border into DRC. So it was very kind of strict enforcement of this regulation. And as a result, the environment was quite clean, right? Rwanda and Kigali are some of the cleanest places that I have been, and I think they remain that way. But in talking to business owners, there was some hesitation and some feelings that these businesses were no longer able to compete with imports from other countries. And they were talking about certain things like baby diapers, for example, meat, fruits and vegetables, things that needed to be kept hygienic or needed to be kept kind of sealed so that the foods could be preserved. And so there were some companies that were trying to innovate with creating things like wax paper, other types of coverings for these different products. But obviously that came at a lot more of a cost. And at the time, things that were imported in could still be packaged in plastic. And so thinking about all of the different economic considerations, how this might hinder the development and kind of the economic prospects for different businesses within the country. Lots were debated, and there were kind of lots of conversations that were being had. A couple years later, they did reverse the ban on plastic packaging. So there's still a ban on plastic bags, but plastic packaging is still allowed for certain things. And I think this, that tension between environmental protection and development, there can be these unintended consequences that come through some of these regulations. And it's through that conversation with different sectors and understanding all of the different needs that maybe you can strike a bit of a balance.
And after returning then to the US, you joined the Global Environment and Technology Foundation. You were working on public private partnerships in water and sanitation. You traveled to many African countries and you worked with companies like Coca Cola and Diageo. What did that experience teach you about the role of corporations in development?
Yeah, it taught me a lot about how we need multiple sectors of society to solve these very large challenges that we have. I think in the different parts of Africa that I traveled to and the program that I was working on was really trying to work in every country in Africa. A company like Coca Cola has operations in every country in Africa. They want to ensure that their employees are safe, that their customers have access to clean water and sanitation. And so I was a part of a team that was managing a program that was trying to reach 6 million people with access to water by 2020. So seeing that there were some gaps that government was not able to fill, and that companies like Coca Cola have access to resources, whether those are financial resources or their employees or their suppliers and the connections that they have, and that they can support communities directly and also support government programs to help to accelerate progress towards the global goals like the sustainable development goals around water and sanitation was very clear and very eye-opening that the private sector does have a role to play and has a responsibility to be good water stewards, taking back to that word of stewardship that I mentioned before, and can do so in a way that is supportive of what the governments are trying to achieve. I really did see firsthand just how the private sector can innovate, can help accelerate, can support government, and I think also needs to be part of the solution to some of the global challenges that we have.
And you said that despite the impact of the work that you were doing, something felt like it was missing, and particularly environmental conservation. What felt incomplete about water and sanitation work without conservation?
Yeah, great question. As I mentioned, I'm an environmentalist at heart and have been since I was very young, and so I did see and it still feels this way today, still working in the water sector, that there are silos between the water and sanitation teams and the environmental conservation teams. And I think some of that is coming a bit closer together, but there was a true sense of urgency around, from kind of a public health perspective, in a lot of the work that I was doing, that communities did not have access to water, communities did not have access to sanitation or hygiene stations. Children in schools were oftentimes getting sick in these locations. The natural environment was being contaminated sometimes with the poor water quality. And so there was a feeling that we need to move as quickly as possible to get access or to get the sanitation facilities in there. And so the idea of doing what we talk about in the conservation field is kind of more broader scale water resources management or watershed level planning. Let's think about where the water is coming from. Let's take some time to do a longer study and kind of bring in more science to figure out how we could improve the system from a holistic perspective, potentially using nature, was sometimes seen as taking too long, right? This is an urgent issue of public health. And so we did have lots of conversations around sustainability in general. How do we ensure that the water systems that are being put in place can be sustained over time and are not going to be detrimental to the environment? But what I felt was missing was this idea of, maybe nature could be part of the solution as well. Maybe we could think at a broader system level scale about how to solve some of these challenges beyond just the engineering question of, where do we put the well or where do we draw the water from the system? And I felt that I had expertise and experience from, working on these issues before and from my studies, that I wanted to do more from a conservation perspective, and was introduced to some of the Nature Conservancy's work that was doing a bit of both. And so felt that it was possible to move into that sort of space.
So you started working with the Nature Conservancy with the Coca-Cola Africa Foundation, where you were supporting farmers to improve water outcomes for Nairobi. Can you walk us through that project and why it mattered?
Yeah, so this is the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund. It's a program outside of Nairobi in Kenya that is working with over 50,000 farmers at this stage to implement things like agroforestry practices that reduce the amount of silt that's going into the Tana River, that is the source of the Kenya electricity and hydropower generation, but also a lot of the water that goes into Nairobi itself. So seeing this kind of intersection of understanding, where is the water coming from? What is the source of the water for the city and for its power? What are the challenges that that water source is facing, which included kind of high levels of siltation that were coming from erosion on the hillsides? And who is living in this area? Who are the key stakeholders? How could we potentially work together with them to improve these practices that could have so many benefits, including the livelihoods for the farmers, as well as improved electricity generation and water supply? And obviously, companies were very interested in this sort of program because they also rely on this water for their operations. And so the Nature Conservancy was able to set up a public private partnership, bringing together all of these collaborators. They've received funding now from the Global Environment Facility and others to continue to support this watershed protection work, really, but also that has development implications as well. And so it's the type of program that shows, if you think about a system scale landscape level initiative and what are kind of the root causes of some of these challenges, that you can really have multiple benefits across that landscape.
And today you work at the Nature Conservancy and you focus on private sector engagement and freshwater systems across 83 countries. For listeners who may not know, what does nature-based solutions actually mean in practice?
So, nature based solutions, there are a number of definitions that you can find online. We align a lot with the one from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which describes nature based solutions quite broadly, which is just around actions that protect, conserve, restore, or create natural ecosystems that have benefits to people and to nature. So it's a broad concept, right? But the idea is, how do you use, restore, or create natural ecosystems in ways that deliver kind of those ecosystem services or what nature provides to us as people? Can look like a wide range of things, and that includes, and I can talk about some of more of the practices in Kenya. So, restoration of the areas along a river. So, in addition to the planting of trees within farming systems, that's what I refer to as agroforestry. You can also plant grasses, so additional grasses in strips alongside a river. And that can help to keep some of the soil from coming off the side. And so you're using nature there, right? You're putting a plant in the ground, and that nature is what is delivering that service of improved water quality. We talk about other things like tree planting or reforestation. So, areas that used to be forest, but some of that has been cleared for different reasons. If you plant more trees in those areas, that can help to stabilize the soils. And we also consider things like wetlands. So, areas that are sometimes inundated by water when it rains or during the rainy season. But some of those have been cleared or dredged, and so you can restore those wetlands and have water quality benefits. You can also have benefits for wildlife, like migratory birds, for example, who rely on those little ponds when they're traveling north or south at different seasons. And so it's this idea of using nature, either restoring it. Sometimes you might be creating a wetland, for example, in a place where there wasn't one. But then you can see the benefits that it has for nature as a whole, but then also for people specifically.
And can you share a concrete example of a project that you're currently working on that brings together companies, development finance institutions, and conservation?
Yeah, so I think the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund is a really great one. Another example that I can share is the Greater Cape Town Water Fund. So in Cape Town in South Africa, people may remember that the city was about to reach day zero in 2018, which was the day that the city was going to run out of water. And so the Nature Conservancy was working in that area and was assessing, again, kind of what are the root causes of diminished water supply, and saw that there were a number of invasive species, invasive trees, trees that were not originally from South Africa, that had invaded the area and were very thirsty, were sucking up a lot of the water. And so, invasive species removal, clearing out those trees, is another form of a nature based solution. And our science found that in doing so, that could return about 20% of the water that was needed for the city of Cape Town over time. So we have started a program there since 2019, the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, that has cleared over 30,000 hectares of land, and that's allowing the native fynbos vegetation to come back. So it's a very unique biome in South Africa, these really beautiful flowers and plants. So those are able to come back because these trees are removed, and we're seeing additional water going back into the system. And so through that program, you had the government of Cape Town and the national government of South Africa investing in it. You also had companies like the Coca-Cola company, also PepsiCo was part of it. Microsoft has invested in that. They have facilities there. Hotel chains were part of this. And so a kind of coalition of companies came together to invest in it as well. And then you've also seen interest from groups like the World Bank in the development finance space, thinking about kind of broader policy implications. How do they support the government and what the government needs, and work together around like a larger scale invasives clearing program. So those are the sorts of programs that the Nature Conservancy works on. And then in my role on a global team, we're also trying to continue to work with these corporations and development finance institutions at a headquarters level to elevate the importance of nature based solutions, to provide trainings to different staff on what these things are, why they're important, why they should be considered as part of the conversation, and then provide support to our different country teams who are considering setting up these programs with other local partners.
Now, based on your work with development financed institutions, what's one misconception that they have about incorporating nature into water strategies?
One misconception I would say really relates to how easy it is to implement these solutions and what the benefits look like. So it's been hard to convince these partners to adopt nature based solutions because of a bit of what we refer to as path dependency, that a lot of these institutions are used to doing very large scale engineering projects that have very clear specifications and the results are clear and can be replicated quite easily. When you talk about nature, a lot of it is very context specific. Sometimes it can take some time, right? The trees need to grow. Sometimes something might happen and some of those trees may die off. So it's not as guaranteed is what some of their partners are feeling, as some of those traditional, what we call gray infrastructure, so concrete infrastructure solutions. So we have been working against some of these misconceptions to showcase, there are strong evidence bases for the fact that nature can deliver similar benefits to some of the more traditional engineering systems that have been used in the past number of decades, and really just raising awareness about nature-based solutions, what they can do, how they compare to other solutions, and raising that awareness, not just within the development finance institutions, but also within the countries where development finance institutions are doing their work, so that there is demand from these solutions from kind of the host country governments that these institutions are working with. So yeah, that misconception around how effective the solutions are and whether or not they can deliver, I think we try to remind people that planet Earth has been around for millions of years. Nature has been delivering water, clean water to us for a very long time and knows what it's doing. So I know that we as people sometimes feel that we also know what we're doing with the engineered solutions that we have, but there's a lot that we can learn from nature and some trust that we should put in it.
Now, I'd like to turn to the Nature Conservancy itself. The Nature Conservancy, it's a science-backed organization with a $1 billion annual budget and 6,000 staff. What are the biggest leadership challenges in an organization of that scale?
Many leadership challenges, I would say. I mean, I think it's quite a large organization. And I think when you're working in an organization that functions globally, ensuring that information is communicated promptly and correctly and that makes sense in ways that translate for all of the different contexts that you're working in can be a really big challenge. And I think for an organization like the Nature Conservancy that works with a lot of different partners from different sectors, I think there can also be a challenge around prioritization and setting goals that will make sense globally, but still be able to translate locally. And so, having been at the Nature Conservancy for 9 years and seen a number of different iterations of global goals that we have as an organization, you can see how that tension comes through, that we want to create something that makes sense for a global organization that's trying to solve global environmental challenges. When you say those terms or those goals that you have in places like India or China or Kenya or Brazil or Peru or the UK, the words make sense to people and will galvanize action. And so I think that's a big leadership challenge when you're working in a global organization, just to get those global goals and priorities correct.
And speaking of different priorities, you've talked about competing priorities for partners. How do you make a case for conservation in places where it's just not their top concern?
We see that a lot. There's so many competing priorities within development finance institutions and corporations, whether that be, conservation, climate change, biodiversity, agriculture, fisheries. We come up against this all the time. I would say having a strong business case has been something that has been really critical for the Nature Conservancy. In our freshwater work, we've done a lot around return on investment analysis. And so, how do you look at the watershed scale, understand where nature based solutions could be deployed, think about what the benefits might be, and are there any savings to the water utility through this? And how does that compare to what needs to be invested? I think that's one way to make the case that conservation can deliver benefits in ways that make economic sense. It's something that's been very important to the Nature Conservancy to bring in that economic business case. And sometimes that can help with the competing priorities and ensure that these partners consider conservation as one of the tools in the toolbox.
And then climate change and biodiversity loss and freshwater scarcity, they're all problems that are deeply connected. What gives you hope that we can actually address them at scale?
It gives me hope when I see that some of the programs that I've mentioned in this conversation that are achieving scale within the region or the country where they are. So sometimes we think about very small projects, and as an individual person, there's only so much that you can do. But if you see that move to the scale of a community and to the scale of a city and the scale of a watershed, and you're talking about tens of thousands of farmers or tens of thousands of hectares, it feels like more progress is being made. And I also generally feel hope when I do talk to these different partners in different sectors and are hearing more conviction and also more comfort with these terms, hearing sometimes corporate CEOs mention nature-based solutions, or seeing that the different development finance institutions now have goals around climate and biodiversity and are thinking about adaptation and things like that. That also within the highest levels of some of these really critical institutions around the world, topics of conservation, climate change, and environment are being discussed. Gives me hope that we're making progress and that things will improve. I am still a little nervous about meeting the goals in time and things like that, but I am hopeful that progress is being made.
And finally, for Harvard alumni and global development leaders listening, what's one mindset shift that you believe is essential if we're going to mainstream conservation into global developments?
That's a great question. I think one mindset shift that is really critical is around risk taking. And so I think if there is an ability to think about, can I take a calculated risk and try something new? Why do I have to continue to do what I've always done? I think if we can see some of those mindsets shift a bit in these spaces, I think to some of the challenges I've talked about in this conversation around that path dependency of doing things the ways that things have been done in the past, or trying new solutions, some of that innovation that we talked about that I saw when I was a child. That idea of, can I be a bit of a risk taker? Not a huge risk, not risking everything, but maybe on this one project, let's add a component that's related to climate change. Or maybe in this meeting with this partner, I could mention, have you ever thought about nature-based solutions? These tiny little risks or shifts that you can make that can open up minds and hopefully bring in some different elements into conversations and programs, I think would be wonderful for all of the Harvard Alumni for Global Development to take with them.
Well, Naabia, thank you so much for sharing not just your work, but also the systems thinking behind it. This conversation has been a really powerful reminder that sustainable development isn't about choosing between people and the planet. It's about designing systems that ultimately support both.
Exactly. Thank you, Michelle. It's been wonderful talking to you.
For our listeners, we'll include links to Nabia's work at the Nature Conservancy in the show notes. This has been Global Minds. I'm your host, Michelle Kawamoto Perry. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.